Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to your favorite show. Thank you very much for subscribing, liking, and sharing. Please continue to introduce us to other people who haven't yet been part of the tribe. We who are part of the tribe, we love it, and we're always introducing new guests. And this is part two. I think part one was a very exciting one, but we thought, you know what? Rachel is such a lovely guest. Let's actually have a rabbit hole session. Because there's a lot that we need to discuss. I think part one, we barely scratched the surface. But you were quite a sport, eh?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And she's got a bit of fight in her.
I'm trying.
No,
My
good,
goodness.
Good fun. So you guys have decided to give up on the tea because of the heat?
Yeah. But you know what? The interesting bit is you're the one who's sweating.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think my body's much more sensitive to the heat than yours.
No. That's why you have tea.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
then, but if that was true, why have you guys cooked the tea?
I think you can only have... How many cups of tea can you have?
One for me. One at a
There
time
you go.
is sufficient.
Is
I
it the
had-
caffeine? Is it?
I think I had 3, and then I think... Yeah, the caffeine and also just, it's not alcohol. Mm-hmm. It's not until you...
See, we don't have that problem in the fun part.
Yeah. But part two, it's a rabbit hole. But what I want us now to discuss, continuing with personality in the marketplace, is I want to look at the, we need to zoom out a bit because I think we were focusing the individuals and CEO. That was a nice little debate we had there about CEOs and entrepreneurs and the different personalities. But I want us to zoom out a bit and look at nations and national psyche. If you look at America, you look at Africa, you look at Zimbabwe, you look at South Africa, and you look at China, we all have different psyches. And, when people move and as they migrate, do they pick up on a national psyche? And is there such a thing? So those are the things that we want to discuss, and we will get into the rabbit hole. And the rabbit hole will get us as far as we can. We don't know what will come out, but I'm looking forward to this. And I hope you as an audience will enjoy this. I'm finding it riveting and very enjoyable. But to start off with, maybe let's talk about childhood trauma and its impact into adulthood, right? Because maybe that's a good place to start. Yeah. And the question I have for you is childhood trauma, fact or fiction?
Absolute fact. Absolute fact. Because trauma changes the body and trauma changes the mind, trauma changes the brain. And so essentially the way we show up as adults has a lot to do with our childhoods. And this is something we take for granted as leaders. I always, especially with my clients, I'm always trying to say, let's go back to the beginning, because a lot of our behaviors, similar to personalities with a nature nurture, from a nurture perspective, a lot of our behaviors can also be explained from the childhood experiences that we've had. I mean, a fascinating study was done that essentially shows that children who grow up in environments where there's a lot of harshness or strictness, and also corporal punishment, so you're hit a lot as a child. People who grow up like that become consummate liars. They're very, very good and very effective at getting themselves out of trouble. And it makes sense, right? Because you were brought up in such a way that the implications for behaving in a specific way, the punishment was quite severe. And so for your own sense of survival, you start to sort of figure out how to dodge and dive. And I think this is important because we are a country, for example, of people who've had a lot of corporal punishment. And what I think that has done...
Corporal punishment starts from biblical times.
Oh, no, of course it does. I'm just saying, as Zimbabwe, we have
You
a
sound
lot
like
of
a
that.
fan of corporal punishment.
Yes, I am.
Here's the thing. And I'm not making a judgment here about whether it's good or bad. I'm making an observation about what its impact is. What I think it has done on the national psyche, what I think it has done for our country is this. A lot of us were hit as kids, and then we were told we shouldn't have the consummate emotional response to being hit, right? So being hit is painful. It for a child is actually quite severe, right? But you were told, Gara, you're not allowed to have a response. You're gonna cry, you'll get another one. And what that did was it made us extremely disconnected from our own emotions. And I find that Zimbabweans by national culture are passive aggressive, right? Which is that they are not very good at expressing what they really want or what they really need, which is why you can have a conversation with somebody about a deal and you go down a rabbit hole and it looks like they're saying yes, but really they're actually going towards no. And then you're sort of confused at the end of how did it turn out this way? Mm-hmm. And my sense is that a lot of that comes from experiences we've had in our younger years that we are not necessarily connecting to our adult responses or reactions in the world. And so to make an assessment of your childhood is one of the most important things you can do as a leader.
And what tools are you using? What exactly are you? Is it a sobbing story where I'm sitting down with a psychologist or a therapist?
Not necessarily. I mean, where there's trauma, you might want to absolutely have a therapist support you with that. I mean, Kaiser Permanente did research on what they call the ACEs, the adverse childhood effects, based on adverse childhood experiences. And they essentially showed that, if you had, you want to think about 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional family and home environments. So in terms of abuse, physical, physical, emotional, sexual, in terms of neglect, physical, social, and then in terms of dysfunction in the family, was somebody an alcoholic in your family? Was your mother beaten when you were growing up? Did you have mental illness?
Okay, let's zero in on one so that it becomes real for us.
Yes.
Father was an alcoholic. What does that mean?
So again, it would register depending on your temperament, and this is personality. So interesting. Sometimes you have you have 2 children in the home. Father was an alcoholic. Maybe as a result of that, he became very loud. The introvert child might be very affected by that, right? Which essentially means they can withdraw because it's too much stimulation for their system. Whereas the extrovert child might actually be like, this is very interesting behavior. This is fascinating noise, right? Lots of noise. So again, you want to watch for those things to say, based on my temperament, what was the impact of that? But what this research was essentially trying to show was, based on those experiences, people who've had a lot of adverse experiences are more likely to commit suicide, are more likely to end up diabetic, are more likely to have heart attacks, are more likely to be themselves abusive, right? So it's a fascinating thing to watch, because I've always said it's always good people that become bad leaders, which is that you're just a normal average guy, you're a normal average girl. You've had a particular life experience and you haven't assessed what has it done. And so you have leaders who are discharging a lot of anger in the environment, in the work environment, or you have leaders who are very blame prone. And by the way, we are a very blame prone culture.
Society.
Or leaders who are very reluctant to collaborate with others because they're very untrusting. A lot of those things have to do with cultural dynamics in our societies that were often just, that's normal. It happens to everybody. But actually it's had an impact on the way in which we show up in our adult lives.
And what's a good principle? So, father was an alcoholic. Father was a workaholic.
Again, it depends. It depends, right? If the father was a workaholic but also abusive, it might be a relief for the children that he's actually not at home. If the father is workaholic, but the children are actually needy for the father's love, which by the way, every child is, and want their father to be at home, then it can create sense of abandonment, sense of rejection. And that's when you get things like fatherless women syndrome, fatherless men syndrome. So you can actually start to see that people are having real psychological reactions to the things that they're experiencing.
Father was away in a war. Because that's actually very, very peculiar to Zimbabwe. Right?
Yeah.
So father was away in a war. Yeah. What is that? What would you say?
Again, dependent. I want to be very clear that a lot of these things depend on other coexisting factors, right?
Okay.
But essentially, we know that the absence of a parent in a child's life has an impact. And a lot of that having to do with rejection, abandonment, a sense of the yin-yang, the balance in the home might be missing. And this becomes quite controversial, especially in a world where I think single parenthood has become very...
prominent.
Yeah, but not just prominent, also celebrated.
Okay, maybe speak to that.
And I want to be very clear that I think if you find yourself in a situation where you are a single parent, it's not to say that there should be any indictment on you, because sometimes we find ourselves in these situations. But many single parents will tell you how difficult it is, right? To find that balance between what you impart to your child and how you impart it if there's only one of you, and if there isn't a sense of a shared dynamic around the yin and yang, the masculine, the feminine, however you want to call those energies, that then can help to create balance in the child's life. And so again, it depends on the context. If I am fatherless and yet I'm surrounded perhaps by uncles or by older brother siblings who bring that kind of influence into my life, then it may create balance for me. But if I don't have that too,
it's never the same. I think the kids,
and it's also not the same.
A father is a father, institutionally, right? A father is a father, or a mother is a mother. Institutionally, that's an institution that's been created, and you can't substitute any institution.
Yeah,
it's always very difficult. That's interesting. That's so Shumba, what do you think the impact was on our growing up? The sort of society that we grew up in. Now, I always say this, and I think it's the same for our audience as well. And I want you to listen into this conversation because it's one that I'm particularly interested in, and it blows me over every time I think about it. We had the same type of radio. We had the same type of black and white TV. We had the same type of, soccer ball. We had the same type of clothes. We went to exactly the same stores. Like, our lived experiences were exactly the same. If I went into your home, I could exactly know where the display unit was, the sort of plates you had, the TV, I could operate it, which is fundamentally different. I mean, now if I get into your home, everything is different from my home. There's a bit of variety. But when we grew up more or less, or the consumerism was more or less the same. Do you think that has impacted on the national psyche?
Yes and no. I think it's a difficult question because a lot of certainly people in our demographic who are ambitious, who are driven, who were go-getters, left for a long time. Many of them haven't come back, right? You're one of the exceptions who's,
For now.
Right. So we've got a huge diaspora. So a lot of the thought leaders, a lot of the rebels left. And I think it's fair to say that, the people who were less rebellious, who are more compliant, who are, dominate those who stayed. And that has an impact on our national psyche. Because, which is why whatever our issues, we're just less disposed to going onto the streets, to pushing back. Even, if you look at the business community, one of the gripes that we have all the time here is that you have a policy announcement that's clearly bound to fail and do a lot of harm. And a lot of leaders in the business community simply aren't comfortable calling it out publicly. And it's questionable that they do this behind closed doors when they do have the opportunity to. And it's part of the psyche of being politically correct, of playing nice with power and authority. That I think has held us back from progress.
Can you identify with this conversation, and is there a national psyche? Let's go down a rabbit hole.
Absolutely. I mean, Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious, which is that there's a stream of consciousness that we belong to based on the nation that we belong to, the culture we belong to, the community we come from. And so as a result of that, it's often uninterrogated because it's unconscious, but it's there. Right. And in fact, sometimes you even see it in companies, and I'll come back to the nation just now, where you join an organization and you start to behave like the people in the organization, even though you disagree with what they do, or maybe even you agree with what they do. It's like it's contagion. And I think a part of that is also, by the way, we now know with neuroscience, mirror neurons, which is that there's essentially imitational behavior that we all take on based on what we see allows you to survive in an environment. So you start copying.
Anecdote about
right?
this.
You start copying people.
At one of Tinashe's firms, whenever we visited him, so Tinashe's a fashionista, and he likes to dress in a particular way.
Yes.
And and if you visit him at his office over enough time, you just see all the new staff just starting to take on these fashion cues. All the young males after a certain amount of exposure looked like mini Tinashe.
Because it makes sense. What the signals are that are being sent to the brain is, because we are very smart. The human brain is smart. This is acceptable, but not only that, it is what allows you to belong. And the human brain solves for belonging, right? So it says, what is the thing that won't make me stand out and therefore put me at risk of harm? This thing. And so I'm going to dress this way. I'm going to talk this way. I'm going to behave this. And we see this with a lot of influential people in the world. People start to imitate them. But I mean, on a national level, to the point that Farah was making earlier, Hofstede and Erin Meyer are, I think, some of the leading researchers on this, where they looked at they did cultural assessments where essentially you can measure where in a continuum cultures sit in terms of certain behavior. And Zimbabwe is very much a high power distance culture, right, versus low power distance.
And when you say high power, you mean the difference between, the little me and the big Ohona.
Exactly. So there's a sense that we all agree that you must be careful how you traverse that gap. Right. It's also very much a hierarchical culture, which means that there's an assumption that the people at the top know better, do better, are to be imitated, right? Than the people who
mimicry.
are to mimicry. Exactly. We should mimic those. It's also a culture, by the way, of not very overt feedback, which is to say feedback here is given via. You're safer doing feedback via.
That's how
versus to the point.
That's just how, or even at Edare, when you want to pass a story or everybody's in the same room, right? But we sort of have to whisper to the next guy and say Zwanzi.
Yeah.
And then the next guy whispers to the next guy and to the next guy. But that's just a cultural practice or a tradition. Are you saying that actually affects our national psyche?
Absolutely, but that is it's acceptable norms. That is the psyche, right? The psyche is what are the values, the norms that we all agree are the way of being that is acceptable. And I think it's so important because, I mean, when I studied anthropology, one of the things that becomes very clear when you study anthropology is that cultures are made, right? They're not thrown from heaven. They're made. We make them as societies, and we can choose to unmake them. But that requires a level or a capacity to have critical conversations like these ones around what is our culture and does it serve us? So one of the things I have a big issue with in organizations in Zimbabwe, for example, is this feedback issue. I've always said, feedback I find in our country is akin to witchcraft. I mean, if you people get so offended by feedback, like almost like, how dare you, do you know who I am? How dare you say I'm not doing this thing correctly? We don't think of feedback as a gift. We don't think as feedback as something that is actually, in fact, central to the intelligence of an organization. And so I think in many ways we stay where we are because everybody's being politically correct. Everybody's measuring their words.
But the market is extremely, so with organization, so where I would sort of differ is with organization, at least the market is extremely ruthless. Yeah. So we get the feedback from the share price.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas with the nation, you can ignore the feedback.
No, but I tend to agree with that, and I'll push back on what you're saying because if you think about, so firstly, our economy is the formal sector is shrinking, but the part of the formal sector that's doing really well, the big platinum mines, your big firms with effectively a monopoly, like your Delta, they don't have much in terms of threats in the marketplace, right? So if you live and work in such an institution, you're much more sensitive to the internal politics than the external environment because you have no control over the price of platinum. and mining is basically like, it's very regimented. Once you build a mine and you're operating it, the key challenge is not doing new clever things. It's keeping the trains running on time, making sure that your safety is up there and your productivity is up there and things are just working. So if you are an individual, a professional within this organization, and you want to thrive, you're much more sensitive to the internal politics than what's the latest trend in mining. What does the future look like beyond the horizon? So it speaks to what you are saying, that it's much more important to be politically correct than to give feedback that might be disagreeable to the powers that be. And that's why our big corporates don't tend to be incredibly innovative and dynamic. They tend to be inward looking. They haven't explored opportunities in the region where the market is bigger.
They're not going to be wiped away.
Yeah, because they're safe.
No matter what happens, they're safe. Okay, it's the little guy who's not safe. Well, the little guy jumps the border. So you've got the big guy, he's safe in his CEO's office. Then the little guy jumps the border. And then what's left in the middle? Nothing. So, okay, that's sounds like a very sad story. What do we need to change as Zimbabwe? So we've identified that there is a problem. The national psyche, there is a particular problem. And as a new nation, what could we have done? So we take Singapore, right, as a very successful young nation. At some point, we were in the same boat, but they chose.
I mean, they got independence just 5 years before us.
Yeah, they chose a particular route, and we know how successful they've become. We know how successful smaller nations like Switzerland have become. Botswana is a next door neighbor. Mozambique, that went through a very traumatic experience. War is very traumatic, but they seem to have found their way. We seem to be stuck in the same rut. What do we need to do? What do we need to do to change? Is it leadership, or is it culture? Is it from the bottoms up? Is it top down?
It's all of it. It's leadership, it's culture, it's top, it's down, but it has to be role modeled at the top. Because if you think about, yet again, the workings of the human brain, it's most likely to imitate the alpha in the room, right? So what is the person at the top doing? How do I read that as allowing my survival? And therefore I'll imitate it. And so we should also be careful that things we're not even noticing are becoming cultures, become a culture in the society too. So now, for example, I think we've got a very hustler type of culture in Zimbabwe, a mentality, which is fantastic for entrepreneurial,
and not entrepreneurs.
Yeah, which can be fantastic on the continuum, because Bingas are also entrepreneurs in some way, right? I think it's a continuum. We must give them the respect they deserve, right?
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's a continuum, right, of where do you sit and how do you do your entrepreneuring, but for me, the question is, what are the values attached to that entrepreneurialism? And I think part of what is concerning sometimes is when you see that our entrepreneurialism is very much connected to a very primal sense of survival. And when it becomes primal, it means that we are now more inclined to say, how do I cut the corner the fastest, the cleverest, so that I can get what I need? So we don't want to reduce ourselves to the basics. And
how do we balance
to bread and butter?
How do we? Because primal form of survival, there's something very unique and very entrepreneurial about that. I don't think.
Yeah, hence it's a continuum.
It's a continuum. I agree with that.
Yeah.
So now I'm asking, how do we balance it out?
Yeah.
What do we need to do?
So do you use the example of Singapore? Let me use the example of, let's say, China. China, if you look at the Hofstede's cultural competencies, I hope I'm calling it the right thing, cultural competences. China is also high on power distance hierarchy, very high on hierarchy, but they're also very high on long-term thinking. Right? Okay. They're also very high.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. So you have to, we can't just be high on all of the things that are anti-progress. We have to say, like, where do we get in the balance? So, and I'm using that example to say, sometimes it's not about eliminating what is already there culturally. So there is beauty in hierarchy. There's beauty in honoring people who've come before us and saying, you have walked a journey. There's a wisdom that comes to that journey you've walked. But at the same time, there has to be an ability to interrogate what are the other things that would need to coexist alongside that hierarchy for us to be a society that is productive. And I think that that's where we fail, because for us, it's that we're high on power distance. We are high on hierarchy. We are very high on short-term thinking. There's a lot of short-termism that happens, right? We're also high on collectivism. So our Hunu culture is a fascinating one as well, because what that sometimes does is that it suppresses people who seek to
thrive,
to leave the masses and do something different. It's almost like there's people just pulling you. Why are you trying to be different? So it's we have to think about what is the collective of these cultural competencies that we have, and which are the ones that no longer serve us, and then have the courageous conversations. As an example, leaders should ask for feedback. In a culture where it's hierarchical, if I'm in my right mind, I'm not going to volunteer feedback to the CEO. Why would I do that? It's career limiting. But if the CEO is asking for the feedback, then all of a sudden I'm much more willing over time to give that feedback. So we have to just...
What's a safe space? What's a culturally appropriate way in which feedback can happen?
Well, we know from a psychological perspective that the feedback that's asked for is the feedback that is most effective.
Which is?
Any feedback. If I invite
like directly,
feedback,
if I say, "Oh, I don't like your hairstyle,"
well, I think we also then have to be discerning, right? About what.
I want us to be very, very prescriptive.
No, I mean,
just so that we get the conversation going.
No, I mean the kind of feedback that is pivotal to our mission and vision, right? That is pivotal to our creativity and the impact we're trying to make in the world. So if we are in an organization and we want to be innovative, so here's an interesting piece of research, and Kellogg School of Management did this research, that you split a room into two. One group talks about embarrassing moments in their life, and another group talks about proud moments in their life. And then you ask those two groups to do a creative exercise, and they particularly use the exercise of what are the different uses you could make of a paperclip. And the group that shares embarrassing moments is likely more creative. In fact, a lot of the time more creative than the one that shares moments of pride. And what they're trying to show is that in moments of relaxation is when people are creative, right? In moments in which the human brain feels psychologically safe is when people become creative. Wow. Now, we create work environments that are command and control, fear-based, right? Everything is about respect the scenery. And so, of course, then we're not going to be creative and entrepreneurial. That's not the culture that creates creativity and entrepreneurialism.
So what you're saying has been, from a national psyche, is actually very interesting, because I think that what birthed what I term the Entrepreneurial Decade was actually in the 90s, where we were at our point of relaxation, moments of relaxation, where we were actually, the tone and the verve in the nation. There was some sort of, peace, because we had come out of the war. There was a lot that was happening in the 80s.
Yeah.
But in the 90s, it sort of like quietened down a bit. South Africa became independent and everything was quiet. And that's when we found entrepreneurs flourishing. But I want to take you back a bit, because what you're saying is actually very interesting. Do you know where the word entrepreneur comes from?
I know it's French. And they were rascals, basically. They were people who were rebellious, who didn't like convention, who wanted to do things.
Well, it was actually government contractors. Yeah. So government contractors used to be big institutions, and they would give a certain dollar for and bid for a tender. And an entrepreneur was a hustler in Binga who came with a price that was way lower, right? And he got the contract, but he had no means whatsoever of delivering. So what he did was hustle, right? And made it happen. Yeah. And more, these people grew. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is the continuum, and what the French then did was to say, fair and fine, fantastic. That's how you won the tender. And yes, you hustled, and that was extremely innovative. But what we're doing is you need to institutionalize whatever your hustle is. So Binga, yes, at the beginning, everyone is in Binga. Even in America, even Silicon Valley, they start in a garage and they then institutionalize. So capital then institutionalizes. It says, yes, we acknowledge you've got the hustle mentality and it's great. You've got the Binga mentality. But what we need to do is to actually institutionalize. Does that speak to the antidote to our Binga culture? Or am I getting it totally wrong? Or how can we reconcile?
I'm actually quite reluctant to call it the Binga culture, but I get where you're coming from. Yes, I think that part of the national temperature at the moment, right, is that the hustling doesn't stop.
Yes.
And at some point, I think, very much to your point, there has to be a point at which the institutionalization happens. And unfortunately, in an economy that is unstable, where things continually change, you'll find that you're just consistently hustling. And so you become like serial small entrepreneurs. And it's very difficult to then establish yourself into an institution that is respectable, that crosses borders, that becomes global. And my sense is that a lot of that stuff is coming from the point you raised earlier, which is how honest are we in our dialogue about the factors that make a country, the factors that make an economy, the factors that make a society, and what works and what no longer works.
Okay.
And there's a lot that works in our country. There's absolutely a lot that works.
Give us an example, like the national psyche that we should be proud of as a nation. Education, I think it's one.
Absolutely.
Our close-knit nature. I think the extended family were very, very...
Absolutely. And I think also the fact that we have a very good balance of materialism and spiritualism. And I think that's quite special.
Do we?
I think so. I do think that sometimes. Okay. Actually, so it goes overboard. Let me take some things back.
So
it goes overboard, but
culture.
there is a sense of a relationship that we still have to nature and to spirit that I think is quite unique to societies like ours. And so as a result, we are not having existential crisis like the rest of the world over things that, for all intents and purposes, are like, well, that's interesting, right? That's wokeism.
Yeah, but that's
there's
because we're poor. And
but I think that's admirable.
And this is why I want to push back on this idea that we've got the right balance, especially when it comes to material ambitions. Like if you look at the Chinese, if you look at a place like Dubai or even closer to home in Rwanda, right? One of the things that is different between the leadership culture in those places and here is that their leadership culture is ambitious. They want to build these amazing things that will capture not just the population, the imagination of the population of their citizens, but the world's. You know, so from Dubai's perspective, they're saying, look, we've got the world's tallest building, right? You know, China's built these amazing infrastructure projects just to inspire their own population, but to inspire the world. Say, look, this is what development looks like. This is what can be done with a leadership that has a vision that executes. And if you think about Kigali, how clean the city is, you know, all the things that make it a hub for innovation and, you know, all the ways that it's succeeded as a city, right? It's because the leadership had a deliberate vision to show off the city, to say, look, if you're in Africa, if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, come to Kigali. We've built this amazing place, right? And that comes from a place of material ambition. Right. So,
don't you think that ability also plays a big role, and meritocracy? That these are nations with a high level of meritocracy and ability, therefore.
Yeah, but I think you know, Zimbabwe's got a lot of talent. It's got a lot of able citizens. I think what's lacking is just the ambition. So if you actually look at the government's stated goals for 2030. Right? And, you know, if we gave them the benefit of the doubt and assume that we're going to achieve everything in that 2030 plan, is that going to make Zimbabwe amazing in an African context, in an international context? Are we going to have things that will be able to show off and say, look at what
But you don't have the best people in the positions.
Yeah, but
whether it's organization or it's national.
Yeah, but I believe everybody who's senior in government has traveled to all these places. They've been to Santon, they've been to Dubai, they've been to Kigali, they've been to Shanghai. They've seen the limits of what can be done that's impressive, right? So, and when they were putting together the 2030 plan, they didn't have any constraints. Nobody said, don't be ambitious.
What I'm trying to say is, in China, ambition is not enough. You've gone through 30, 40 years of economic rigor where you've been tested. Your ideas and your ambitions have been tested at a small level, at a provincial level. Mm-hmm. So by the time you get to national level and you express an ambition, nobody's surprised. People don't care about your ambition. Mm-hmm. What they care about is your long history of actually delivering.
Yeah, okay, but I think you're not addressing my question, because my question is just...
Or is it a question or is it an answer?
It's psychological. It's
okay. Get into it.
And the question is, depending on your lived experience, right? You can either have a mindset where you're just comfortable getting by, or you have a mindset where you are ambitious. You want to do great things, right? And I think that if you think about it in the context of certainly the Shona culture, where you have these areas where people whisper around and everything is regimented and slow.
I get your point.
Okay. You're not going to get... we don't have a history of...
So I can capture it nicely. Almost all our Shona literature books, almost all, whenever someone shows ambition, they're a bad guy. First,
pride comes before a fall.
And, whenever, and that forms part of the national psyche, right? That the literature, what the novelist is trying to do is, they're just a reflection of our society, and we grew up with these stories. Whereas what he's saying is, if you think about Silicon Valley, these are people who were buccaneers in every sense of the word. Like they broke every convention that you can think of. But by doing so, they created something phenomenal.
Yeah.
And in Zimbabwe, we haven't had that psyche. And I think that's the question, right? Like that breakthrough. What do we need to do? First, at a personal level. So what we're saying is we've suffered this trauma, this childhood trauma, and national, at independence, whatever it is, we've had this trauma. It's with us. We were born in this trauma, national trauma. But how do we ensure that these are not triggers that inhibit what we're able to do, and we can break through?
There's a practice I absolutely love in the work that I do, which is called the ABC: awareness, take a breath, make a different choice. And it works at an individual level and at a collective level. At an individual level is to be aware of your own tendencies as a human being. Similarly with persona, be aware of your personality traits, be aware of your character traits, be aware of your IQ. Take a breath, and breath is really about what do your pause moments consist of? So at an individual level, what do you read? Who do you talk to? Who are you surrounded by? What conversations are you having? For example, I was lamenting the other day, and I don't know what this is with the algorithm. Whenever I YouTube anything about a Zimbabwean or a Zimbabwean name on YouTube, the algorithm just goes it becomes the most dysfunctional. Like I'm like, what is this? It's not intelligent. It's like I'm being fed.
You don't find Friday drinks?
No, I'm being fed like nonsense. Honestly, I'm just like, I don't know if it's just my algorithm or if it's, but when I Google, I don't know, Elon Musk, all of a sudden, right, there's a different kind of, something else at the bottom follows. And I'm saying that even our social media, and I don't know if that's intended or accidental, I think that we are being fed nonsense a lot of the time. And so in the pause moments, we are not becoming better. And I think you have to be very, I'm actually reading a book right now called The Right to Think, about how you need to be careful about algorithms, right? And where they lead, the path that they lead you down. But I think we have to be careful as a nation that we're not overly entertained. That's just my warning. We're not overly entertained and under intellectualized. And that's a problem. And then the C is then once you then use that pause moment to then say, what are the different choices I'm then going to make? So, for example, me being an introvert means that networking is not something that I absolutely enjoy doing. I'd rather be at home watching something on Netflix. But if I am conscientious that is my tendency, that's my awareness, if I take a breath and say, what practices can help me become more outgoing, then I'll make the choice to go and network with the rule that I'm only going to talk to 2 or 3 people, which is the introvert's rule, by the way. Just talk to 2 or 3 people and leave.
Mine is actually one.
One and leave. And you're good. That's sufficient. But on a collective level, it's the same thing. Awareness, take a breath, make a conscious choice. Where have we been as a nation? What are some of our collective traumas? What is our collective psychology? Breathe. What are some of the practices that we can start to insert into our system? So, for example, our education system, right? What are some of the things? Are we teaching entrepreneurship? Are we teaching kids to be critical thinkers? I don't know. I haven't been in the education system enough to know and understand. I'm just sort of hypothesizing. But what are we doing with those pause moments so that people are empowered to make different choices around their own lives?
Let me tell you something that you said to me that has stuck with me for a very long time, more than a decade. And it's a pause moment for me because I think it's something that was very profound and nobody had said it to me. And it's got me, and I've oscillated whether, sometimes I go this way and then the next time I go to the right of that particular thought. But this is what you said, and I'm going to articulate, and I hope I do a good job of this. But you said intuition is the highest form of intelligence. Right. I don't know if you remember.
I remember.
One
of the posts, yeah.
And it has stuck with me. Right? Because then I started thinking about what intuition is. And it's just stuck me because as you were talking, it made me think around the national psyche, but also the national intuition, right? And how that is actually being framed. Because we do have an intuition. And as a nation or as people, our intuitions are being formed because while it's the highest form of intelligence, but where's your intuition coming from? And that's being formed by something that you're not aware of. It could be an algorithm that you think it's intuition, but it's coming from an algorithm, and the algorithm has already formed you.
It could be a currency that just over time, miraculously and at a stupefying rate, loses value.
Oh, that's the reality, right? So now my intuition is, if government says anything, I just don't believe them, right? Because of my lived experience. But we're not back to the source. Because if we were back to the source, if we were back to what made us great, which is the original intuition that made our people entrepreneurial, that made them traders, that made them see a bigger vision of what Zimbabwe was, that if we go back to even pre-colonial times as well as colonial times, the people that really drove. I mean, the idea of social roads comes, a lot of people have issues with him, but I don't, because I think he gave us an example of what is very possible in this nation. Right?
From being a rural backwater.
Exactly. To the developed state that we became, a modern state that we became. And he was going on guts and intuition.
Yeah.
Because he didn't know anything about this land.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the people that were here were not going on guts and intuition. Now, how much of this is my personality talking? And how much of this is, can we get back our intuition as a nation?
Well, you know what I think is interesting? I love you're reminding me of this intuition thing, is that what is intuition? It is your ability to perceive beyond the obvious, right? So how much can you read into what's not obvious? And at the same time, it's correct that our intuitions are wired. They're hardwired over time, right? Because we perceive in a particular way based on what we are being fed. And I think that what was interesting about people like Cecil John Rhodes is, I think part of their intuitive force was that, for example, they had nothing to lose, right? These were people who were coming from far away lands and were coming essentially to explore, albeit in a very problematic way, but nonetheless, it was entrepreneurial. And I'm a Mandela Rhodes scholar, by the way, which is interesting because part of the reasoning for bringing the two together is acknowledging that there's something to be learned from a past, even if it's problematic. Like, what can you
It's only
what can you draw
problematic
from it?
through the lens of today's morality, right? So we can
Through presentism,
we
yeah,
can sit here and
absolutely.
say, "Oh, that was awful. They went and they colonized
Yeah,
the place."
yeah.
But we think Julius Caesar was great. Why? Why do we think? What was he doing?
Right.
You know, so
Yeah.
I when I look at these historical events, I don't moralize. I look at it in the context of the day.
Exactly.
Right? If we, the Shonas, were in a position to conquer the Zulus, we'd be celebrating that. We'd be saying, "Oh my gosh, we have this great leader that conquered all of the Limpopo," but that didn't happen, right? Right? So you know, let's look at it through the proper historical context.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
which is why I'm a big fan of Cecil John Rhodes, because I don't moralize about, I don't use today's ethics and morality to judge
Absolutely.
behavior
To explain what happened in the
plus
past.
years ago.
Yeah, and it's dangerous to do so actually, because we actually create a blind spot, a resource blind spot. When you look at history and you say all of it was bad because these particular people were doing it, you create a resource blind spot. There's so much that you could draw and learn from that, and so it's dishonest to say all of it was bad. It's it's intellectually dishonest. But the point I was trying to make is that I think your point on intuition is the wiring of the time and the mindset of the time with the kinds of people like Cecil John Rhodes was essentially coming to explore, right? To explore and see what is possible, and to be curious and to be open to wonder and saying what else is available. And the problem is when society becomes too bread and butter, people lose that sense of awe. They lose that sense of curiosity. Their hardwiring becomes survival. And as we know from how the human brain works, we cannot get to curiosity, to the top of Maslow's hierarchy when we are still dealing with bread and butter issues. And for me, that's what I think is dangerous, right? Is if you've got generations who are just continuing to be in bread and butter issues, then you lose that ability to be innovative and to be creative and to go beyond what is obvious just in front of you right now.
What's an immediate antidote that we could, infect our national psyche, and then we get that wonderment, that curiosity again? What could we do?
And some ambition.
And some ambition. What could we do? What are the steps? Like, if the nation Zimbabwe was a client that has just come to you, what could you do to it to provide that wonderment, that intuition, that again?
I would start with a courageous conversation. I start with all of my clients on courageous conversation, which is what is unnamed that needs to be named. What are the things we need to talk about? What's the elephants in the room?
Okay.
And can we air those out in a spirit of collectivism, in a spirit of saying, I'm not saying this to threaten your position. I'm just saying this because it needs to be said, right? And this is where we may be faltering as a nation. That's where I would start. And then having done that, I think we also have to have a courageous conversation. And you made this point around who are the right people based on persona, temperament, character, IQ, to do the job, to get the job done. I always laugh every time I go and speak at events. People say to me, "Oh, you're such a good speaker, you should become president." And I'm like, zero connection.
Where did you make the connection?
Zero connection. My ability to speak has nothing to do with the ability to run an entire country. I mean, that's not a skill set you can take for granted. And I think that there's after the courageous conversation of naming the elephants in the room, I think we also have to say, am I the right person for the job? I think it's the leader's hardest question. Am I the right person for this job? And if I'm not, let me fire myself. I shouldn't wait for anybody else to fire me. Let me fire myself, because I've got a high enough quality of awareness to know that I don't think I'm doing this well. And then I think also we have to have a sense of urgency, right? Because time, guys, time, we're getting older by the day. The world is progressing. There is no catching up. I mean, if you look at some of the things that are happening in the world today, there is no catching up. I think we honestly have to have a conversation around, if we have a chance, what needs to happen and what needs to happen now.
Philip Mataranyika Nyati has a saying that we only have 90 minutes. And, Cecil Rhodes, the They say his motto: "So little done, so little time, so little done."
Done.
Taught Fasianda Fakam, which was, I have so much to do, and this is a man who did so much, but he felt like because of time, and yet we feel in Zimbabwe it feels like the sun is going to shine forever. So I get that. That's a very important thing. Now I'm going to take a segue. And to get into that segue, I want you to introduce the topic, because then I want you to come in.
Okay.
And it's something that we are particularly strong on, and we particularly feel very strong about, which is free market capitalism.
Okay.
Right? So, and our view is maybe the antidote is a cultural change. So it's not necessarily the leadership level, but really at society level. I mean, the reason why we started this podcast is essentially to spread the gospel
Of captain.
of capitalism, right? Because we felt
Free
like
market kind.
yeah, the free market kind. Because we felt very strongly that what's holding us back is an unbelief in markets and what markets can do. Pricing systems, what that actually means. That actually we have everything else, but that's the thing that we don't have. And we are of the view again that politics is downstream culture. So if you change the culture, the politics will naturally change. And what we need to do is why we have this podcast is so that we can talk about free markets and the benefits of free
Evangelize them.
evangelize free markets. So that's the sword that we're willing to
Yes,
to
and
die on.
and apart for it's called Friday Drinks for a reason.
Yeah. Now, the what I want you to articulate is why we think that communism is problematic from a cultural perspective, is problematic in Zimbabwe, and why we think that free markets can actually help us in having this conversation. We start there. So I want Rufaro Shumba to articulate it, and then I want you to listen to that articulation, and then we want the third dimension.
So first and foremost, I think that it's very important to make the point that, like a lot of very successful ideologies, the motives, the intentions, the aspirational outcomes of communism are noble, right? But the problem is that whenever they've been practiced in reality, they failed miserably. And the reason why it's a particular problem in a Zimbabwean context is because the liberation movements, right, in most of sub-Saharan Africa, and for sure in Zimbabwe, were primarily sponsored by the Soviets and the Chinese, who were at the time hardcore communist nations. So not only did they give us money and weapons and military training, they also gave us this ideology that communism is the solution. This is how you're going to build a great nation via communism. And a lot of the leadership in the liberation movements adopted this vision. And if you think about our education in the 1980s and the 1990s, it emphasizes these values that are very communist and socialist. And even to this very day, when you hear some of the gripes that people in government have about business, right? When you hear language like profiteering, right? When you hear, and they always use euphemisms, like when they talk about the parallel market, right? That, some things can't be left to markets. The state has to intervene. We don't trust the invisible hand of the market. So I think, and I've interacted, and I'm sure it's true for you as well, Tinashe. We've interacted with very well-educated, informed individuals who like communism and socialism, or who think that, free market capitalism has challenges. Look, markets work, but they're open to all these problems. So the state needs to actually play a bigger, larger role. And I think that's definitely one of the things that is holding us back as a country. This belief that command and control economics in the 21st century works. So And that's one of the major reasons why we have the show, to actually point out that
Antidote.
it's failed. Everywhere it's been practiced, it's failed. If you look at the Chinese miracle, it started in 1981 when Deng decided, even though it's still called the Chinese Communist Party, to embrace free market capitalism, to allow people to own property, to build businesses, to encourage entrepreneurship, to bring in foreign direct investment. And it boggles my mind, actually, the extent to which people have faith in these
In communism.
Like the bafflement on your face, both of your faces, like, why?
Yeah. What are we getting wrong?
Why do so many people believe these really atrocious ideas?
Sorry, I need to burst out laughing. Why do people believe these things? It's interesting. I think yet again, the brain is a social brain, which is to say, we know from new neuroscience that essentially we've thought that the brain is individual, but it's actually social, right? Which essentially means that our brains are being wired at a collective level. So whatever the messaging of the time is likely what we're all going to absorb and become indoctrinated by. And so it makes sense that people believe what they believe, because the question is, who's the loudest voice in the room? And also how much fear is attached to that voice, or how much influence is attached to that voice, or how much ambition is attached to that voice. And so what I think is interesting is, how do you diversify voices in a society? Because for me, I don't have a problem so much with somebody here saying they're communist, somebody here saying they're socialist, somebody here saying they're capitalist, or I'm leftist and you're rightist. I have no issues with those things. My issue is when one voice starts to overtake another and there's an entire drowning. And now we're only hearing one voice. Then I get worried about indoctrination. So I think that capitalism has its faults. I think that the argument around you have to be careful around greed, around...
Greed is good.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think greed is human. I don't want to put a value judgment in it. I think to be greedy is to be human, because we are all solving for our own survival. But I think there has to be a cap. And I think that's where governments become useful, is where they can come in and say, here's a cap, and here's where we need to start having a courageous conversation around this. And so my sense is it's about balance. Unfortunately, I'm not going to take the perspective that it's only I think when let's take away the names, I can see where communism, in its idea of shared...
We're all equal?
No, the equal part I disagree with. And that's what I'm saying. Parts of these ideas you can bring together and create a new philosophy that could absolutely be progressive, actually. But I think, again, when we get into these perceptions of, in my world, this is what works, we sometimes miss that it actually is a both and an and. So I don't agree in equality, for example. I think equality as a goal is atrocious, to use one of your words. It's an atrocious goal.
I'll drink to that.
Because I think nothing in nature illustrates equality. I don't think there's ever equality. I think what you can argue for is equity, which is, can we give opportunity such that you are not limited in your opportunity? But there's no such thing as equality, right? Ultimately, pretty girls are going to have a very different life experience to tall men are going to have a different experience.
Adamant on getting us into trouble.
No, I'm serious.
I'm happy it's coming from her.
No, because there's actually a study on pretty girl bias, right? Which is
pretty girl privilege.
Pretty girl privilege, as they call it, and then pretty girl bias as to how people see that, or what it means to be a short guy versus a tall guy in the world, or what it means to be somebody who's got high IQ versus low opposite. There's no equality in nature. In nature. And I think we have to become comfortable with that, which is to say, what is my station and how do I do the best of that station, right? So no matter how much I wish or desire that I was born into the upper classes of society, when Meghan Markle got married to Prince Harry, I mean, every girl in the world was like, I just wish I could be that person who waves, right? It's not you, because there's no such thing. There can't be 20 royal families. There's one.
Well, apparently there's a place
people can have that
that
experience.
we all go to when we die called heaven, where we're all equal.
Well,
no, we actually not.
actually, we're not even when we
not
get
in
there,
heaven.
right?
But I was going
my
to say
point
that there's only one spare.
there is only one spare. That's tongue in cheek, but yes, correct. But here's the thing: is I think that we also make ourselves desperately unhappy. I'm not even answering the question anymore, but I think it's an important point to make. We make ourselves desperately unhappy when we search for equality, because it's unachievable. As a goal, it's absolutely unachievable. And so it's the same conversation we have around, let's say, women on boards. Or women in the organization. And I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And you'll get a company that says we want 50% women in management.
Acronym these days.
Why?
Well, certainly in this bar.
Why 50%? What's the science behind 50%? What if, even with your wanting 50%, only 20% of women are interested in the job? Then your argument is flawed. Right? So you're going to keep trying to get to 50% when there is no 50%.
Absolutely.
Because your goal is equality. No, your goal should be quality. How do we get the best quality people at the top? And so similarly, to come back to the point of communism, capitalism, etc., is I don't think it's an either or. I think it can be a both and. I think I'm more comfortable to say what are the good parts.
Okay, let me push back a bit. So the first thing is, thoughts around meritocracy. That actually capitalism has, a moral hold that communism does not have. And the moral hold that capitalism has is a system of meritocracy. So let the best farmer be the best, be a billionaire, and he gives us cheaper tomatoes, cheaper bananas. Let the best, whoever is good at whatever, let them give us that in society, because we can't be all things.
Yes.
Right? So that's the moral argument.
Yeah.
Now, the problem I have with communism, and especially the Zimbabwean psyche, which is actually very, very communistic. I won't use the word atrocious, but in my view, or the way I understand it, and especially looking at personalities, is that the idea and the notion that someone else knows better what you want is morally inferior concept. Because I, as an individual, know exactly what I want. So this idea that there is a bigger brother or a father or a parent, I'm still being parented when I'm a fully grown adult. You as society have said that I'm a fully grown adult. I earn and I work. If I want to sleep at home and not earn, that should be my prerogative. And if I don't earn, well, tough. Because that's actually the world. That's nature. Nature doesn't say, you didn't work. Oh, you still need healthcare. You still need education. Well, let's give you. So things like free education, I have a problem with it, because free education, if you really think about it, it gives the privilege to those who are intelligent. Because they're the ones who are going to be longest in school. They're going to go right through to university and get the better outcome than somebody who is not intellectually there. They're not intellectually there, but it doesn't mean that they can't contribute to society.
As a plumber or carpenter.
As a carpenter, as a plumber, or financially, it doesn't actually make sense for them. So when you think about it, now we're not saying that in its purest form, capitalism gives us
utopia
or it's heaven.
Right.
Because, and that's a communist trope that they use. That these capitalists, what they're saying is bookish and we can never achieve. What capitalism is saying is that there are inherent defects in human nature and in countries and in wherever. But what we can do is to be the best we can possibly be to ourselves and to society. And it starts with full responsibility of the individual. Trust the individual to make his or her decisions. And let the market punish or reward accordingly. That's the moral
Based on
argument.
your abilities.
Yes.
I guess what I'm saying, and I hope I express this intelligently enough, I think what I'm saying is I struggle sometimes with these binaries of either or, because I think things meet somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
And what I'm saying is when you talk about, for example, communism will decide for me what I want, right? And that's morally reprehensible. Capitalism has traits of that too. I mean, if you look at capitalist philanthropy, aid, right? Or foundations that are sending money to Africa.
We also don't believe in that.
Well, but it is part of capitalism.
It's cronyism.
And the recipient doesn't need to accept aid if they don't want to. They have a choice.
Is that so?
Absolutely.
Is that so?
Yes.
I would beg to differ because I would beg to differ, but let me get myself into a tangle. By the way, I must say introverts are also not very good at thinking on their feet. Yeah, sometimes we get tangled in our own thoughts because there's lots of things happening in my head at the moment. But the point I'm trying to make, which is why I'm worried I make it intelligent.
No, you have the platform. Go ahead.
The point I'm trying to make is, I think that there are components of communism that you find in capitalism. So I don't think anything is as pure as the way you guys are framing it. Would be my pushback.
Okay.
For me, and also the point of you're saying that it's a capitalist trait to say let the market decide. I'm wondering, is it a capitalist trait or is it a common sense trait? Because I think it's a common sense trait, right? And I think sometimes we get
That's a good point.
Yeah, we start to jostle over these categories when the truth of the matter is I'm a proponent of common sense. What actually is logical in this particular moment? And I think that there are times in which, for example, right now with what's happening with social media, I think there's a big role for government regulation, for big government in this conversation. Because otherwise, if
Explain
we just, so for example, the things that young people are being exposed to in the name of companies making money, and the way in which our brains are being changed in the name of making money. Now, in a capitalist world, survival of the fittest, right? You figure it out. You figure out how you consume. We'll figure out how we produce, and we'll meet each other somewhere in the middle. But I think sometimes there's room for a moralistic big brother voice that comes in and says, at a certain point, we have a problem here. But it has to be within reason. It has to be common sense.
Well, we have a problem. Well, I certainly, as a libertarian, I have a problem with paternalism.
Yeah.
So I would argue and I would push back that, if they're adult, then they can view and they can see whatever they want. And I think the moral verve is to encourage certain voices. So it's not to stop, but it's to encourage from a moral standpoint. And I take this view even from Christianity, whether or not we should be a Christian state. I think that Christianity has no business in state business. But I think what Christianity, through our works, through who we are, we should be able to compel others to follow the faith.
Persuade, compel, no. Persuade.
Yes.
Yeah.
Persuade others to follow our faith, not necessarily force them to follow our faith.
Correct. And that's also not common sense. It's not common sense to force people into belief systems.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
It's a good point.
Yeah. I think we have to remember common sense in all issues.
So the producer is now telling me that we need to wind up. So the final question that I want to ask, it's in two parts. So the first thing is the next generation. Should they follow a path of their ancestors' DNA or chart new territory? Yeah.
I love that question.
And, what are the positives and the negatives of that? So our leaders, even as a national psyche, it's already set for us. But what if you had a kid? What should they do? Should they look at their DNA and say, well, this is an advantage that I have, and I'm probably best in this? Or should they chart new territories for themselves?
You're going to get so bored of me saying this, but it's both and, right?
Okay.
Because the one piece is always understanding that you're always going to be on a continuum. There's no breaking away from anything. We are always continuing from where it was left off. And so I think it's our children need to know and understand what that history is, know and understand what worked and what didn't work, and have the courage to leave what didn't work and take what works. But here's where I think it becomes really powerful, is parents, elders, current leaders. The biggest gift they can give us is to give us permission to be greater than them. Every generation before you, the biggest gift they can give you is to say, I give you permission to be greater than me, to be better than me, to be faster than what I was. And where societies become stagnant is when elders fail to do that. So what people don't talk about, for example, is even in families, you have parents who are jealous of their children. Right? You have parents who will hold you back and ill-advise you because what you're becoming scares them. What you're becoming makes them feel smaller than you, and they don't know how to manage that. But you get that too in societies. You get that too in governments, where people are not giving the baton to the younger generation to say, the only way we keep evolving as a society is when we as the eldership can give you permission to be bigger and better than what we were.
What you're saying is actually what's critical is permission. And as kids, that's what we're looking for from our...
Totally. Kids look for guidance and permission from the adults in their lives. And when adults can role model that well, guidance and permission becomes freedom. There's a guidance that is constricting. There's a guidance that says stay where you are because that's what's safe for all of us. Then there's a guidance that's brave and courageous. I mean, I love Khalil Gibran, who said, your children they don't belong to you, right? They're the universe longing for itself. And I think that there's a universal force at play that consistently wants for the world to continue to become a better version of itself. And I think as leaders, as parents, we need to ask that question of, are we giving that permission? And I think with those two gifts of children who are able to look to the past and say, what can I take with me? What must I absolutely leave behind? And parents and elders who are not afraid for greatness in the form of the generation after them. That's how we create powerful societies.
My mind is going crazy, and I need another 5 minutes with you because you've just sparked a lot of thinking in my brain. So there are two things, again, I want you to, because this is very powerful thought that you're saying. We need permission. Now, in a society where when you look at the colonial powers, we were not given permission, right? We had to fight for permission. Well, it wasn't even given to us. We fought for it. Yeah. Whereas I think permission would then have allowed us to cultivate ourselves in a particular way.
Absolutely.
So we were not given that permission. And we are, as a nation right now, again, it's like we're fighting. You know, we're not being given that permission. And why I'm saying so is because I'm not even looking at it politically. We're jumping the border. Half the population is jumping the border. It's not being given permission, right?
Yeah. The lack of the permission.
So are we not creating a bigger monster?
The lack of the permission is what creates revolution. When you give the permission, it creates evolution. And that's the fundamental difference. When there's permission and you are blessed, there's a blessing that comes from the eldership to say, go forth and multiply and be whatever you need to be, then society evolves. When you're not given that, society goes into revolution, which is that people start to find means and ways that are almost unnatural because nobody wants to fight against their parent. Nobody wants to fight against their government. Nobody wants to fight against their eldership. We all know that there's something fundamentally wrong with that. But if you're not given the gift of that continuity, you create strife in the system. And so my sense is that it is a humility that is needed in those who came before us to acknowledge the moment in which we need to say, you can be greater than me, and I'm okay with that.
That's powerful because if you think about it, someone who's jumping the border, right? They're running away from something. They haven't been given permission. And when they're in the diaspora, the conversation is not happening. It's like the prodigal son. Whereas what they really want is permission. Like the diaspora to be part of Zimbabwe's, development. What they want is just permission. They need that conversation where with the parent, although I'm not paternalistic, but yeah, I get the analogy that with the parent as the state says to its citizens, yes, I'm sorry you had to jump the border. Yes, I'm sorry that you face xenophobia wherever you are. Yes, I'm sorry that I haven't been able to protect you and you've had to go out on your own and do whatever you can to provide for me as a state, because, the state is now anchored on diaspora remittances. But let's have the conversation where you have my blessing. and you
Blessing.
can then.
The blessing is everything. It matters. It absolutely matters. Otherwise, it creates strife in
important
the
for
system.
sure. We need that.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was a whirlwind, eh? But it's at a place where I'm comfortable. I've reconciled with my head. So what tends to happen with me is if it doesn't make sense, I have so many questions in my head. But I'm at a place where I can sort of agree and I can acknowledge. And this is the third dimension that we actually needed in this conversation. And what I hope that you have learned and you have gained from this conversation is that there's always a third dimension, and personality does play a big role in the marketplace. And the national psyche is something that we can change. There are antidotes, there are ways in which we can improve. We need to acknowledge where we are, and we need to find ways in which we can improve as a nation. There's so much to this great nation, and I think that I have gained, and I
you
hope
should say potentially great.
Potentially great nation. There you go. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful weekend. We've had ourselves a great time, and I hope you will come back.
If you invite me, I will. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for having
Cheers
me.
to that. Huh? Yeah, no, thank
Cheers.
you so much.
Water.
Sorry, that doesn't really count.
Thanks.